I was just, my other kid this morning, the first thing that she showed me this morning when she woke up was this picture that she had posted on Instagram, which was a picture of the towers, and a sort of a meme saying like, have respect for the day today. And she wrote something like, what kind of people do something like this? And, she's 10 now, so we can actually have sort of conversations about this.
Tell her evildoers?
Well, I don't really get into that so much, but she wanted to know like what was my day like that day, because her mom and I were dating at that time, and her mom, my wife, obviously, and well, it's not obvious, but I mean, I think people who listen to the program know. But I mean, I remember quite explicitly. I remember quite explicitly that day. And so, I told her, but it's just weird to me that she doesn't know a world. She didn't live. She has, 9/11 is sort of this weird thing in her mind that is really only a function of like the half stories she's heard about it, and the sort of the way that people talk about it, and the construction of the Freedom Tower, now sort of more sensibly named the World Trade Center. And
well, quickly, I don't mean to interrupt, but it's funny along those lines. So somebody was saying the other day, those 6-year-olds who were sitting in that classroom are now like 20 years old.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And then when you think, that kind of puts it all in perspective, right?
Yeah. When George Bush was reading them, what was it, The Little Train That Could, or I can't remember what it was. But
oh, yeah, that's right. He was reading them, what was it? My Pet Goat.
My Pet Goat.
The Pet Goat.
Right.
Something like that, yeah.
And a very strange time in New York and around the country, and and then a worse time in many respects, sort of following it and seeing what was happening in this country. I mean, I had taken a trip with my wife, I think later that year, to Cuba for a documentary she was shooting. And I remember sort of coming home from Cuba, seeing all the sort of the propaganda billboards in Cuba, because they have no commercial billboards. It's all sort of propagandized. And then going to visit my friend in Lincoln, Nebraska, and seeing the same type of propaganda billboards that had to do with 9/11 in Nebraska. And I just remember thinking like, this is strange. And I remember thinking like that total awareness program, TIPS, they were pushing that, where cable guys and postmen and anybody who would come to your house were going to be sort of like quasi-deputized to spy on people. This was it. This was proposed. This was very close to happening, and experiencing that same sort of thing by a neighborhood watch in Cuba, and just thinking like, wow, this is the way it happens. I want to get your sense of the sort of the of where we are in the wake of 9/11.
Well, I have sort of two tracks that I look at it on. I look at it on the country and personal. On the country, in the track for this country, yes, nothing has ever. I mean, not in the way that right-wingers say it, because they're full of crap in so many ways and use it as a political device, as they do so much. But there's just no doubt that is a dividing point in this country. I feel like they're almost, how you always say, things come in threes. It's sort of, you had the stolen Bush election, you had 9/11, and then you had Iraq. And all three of those things to me, really just changed the fabric of the country that I lived in, and the one that I grew up, saying that, looking back as we'd hear people from the generation before us, I was born just around the turn of the year in 72, a few days before that. And so I didn't know Watergate, the church hearings, except for what I read later on, the kinds of things that were going on that the CIA was doing in terms of assassinating foreign leaders, the kinds of things that were going on with illegality up to the highest levels, that was so overt. That in the 90s, when we had peace and prosperity, And I'm not saying everything was perfect. I mean, in retrospect, obviously, things like getting rid of Glass-Steagall were a terrible idea. But from the perspective of the 90s, when I was living it, when I was in college and going through this stuff, it seemed like everything seemed like it was in front of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like the stuff that we've now gone through again and lived through was history. It wasn't, we'd gotten past that. We were a country moving in a forward direction. Everything was positive. Even whether you agreed with what we did in Bosnia or not, it was done smartly. It was done on a limited basis. We lost nobody. You know what I mean? I mean, what we did was done intelligently, and the economy was growing, and we closed a budget deficit, and all these things were going on like that. People were gaining rights in various ways, it seemed. I mean, and boom. I mean, all of that changed. Suddenly, I see an election get stolen in front of my eyes, which tells me this is not the country that I thought it was. And it's not to say that America is a terrible place. It's just that we were that sort of exceptionalism. I'm not saying I believed it overtly, but these things just up till then in my America didn't happen. You know what I mean? And suddenly it's like, well, quite clearly, it can happen here. We can go backwards. Bush gets into office, doesn't for a moment stop to think that he only was in because of what happened in Florida, and even if he had actually won the damn thing, he would have won very barely. He puts in the most right-wing of right-wing people, completely the hand that people have extended him. He basically spits on it. Of those of us who wanted to come together after 9/11. Not use it politically, and then you see what happens, and they use it to go to Iraq, which those of us who were there at the time, I didn't need to know that the intelligence was false. I didn't need any of that crap. What I knew was what I knew. Saddam Hussein was a terrible person, but a secular actor, part of what provides stability in the Middle East, and to take him out was to open a huge vacuum to probably kill God knows how many people, to waste God knows how much money, and to open a vacuum into which who knew what would step. And of course, we've found it out, haven't we? So that's and then have all this attendant stuff that's come with that, people listening into phone calls and this and that. So that's what I would say. To me, it's changed the track this country's on. I feel like in some ways we've gone back at least to heading back slightly towards where we were. But then the Tea Party movement sort of almost put double down on all this crap. Personally, over time it's gotten easier for me, and that's never been an easy day for me because I was working a city council race. I don't know if people remember, it was primary day in New York.
Mm-hmm.
I consulted on District 1 race. I was up early at 5 in the morning. Blue skies, things were beautiful. I was out. The last thing I could do at that point, there was no more consulting to be done, so I was like everybody else, trying to turn our people out and make sure they voted. And so I was, in my area was Battery Park City. I'd been there the day before. I'd been in the North Tower the day before. And I was headed in that direction to encourage people. I was on Delancey and Ridge on my way there when I saw the gaping hole in the first trade center. And I was called and told about by a friend of mine who saw it from his advertising firm in Astor Place. But I actually saw the second plane come in. Mm. And saw it coming in the whole way, and I was next to this guy I'll never forget, and dressed in a sort of spandex biking outfit, and this woman. We're standing in some school there. We were standing almost in like their yard, their recess yard or playground, and we were looking up, as many of us were.
And wait, where were you at that time? Where
was I?
Yeah, what street you were on?
Right around Delancey and Ridge.
Okay.
And we were like, what, is that plane coming to try to help somehow, right? I mean, not that I didn't know how it could, but I just didn't, we had no idea.
Nobody had a sense after the first plane that it was anything other than
after the first plane hit.
Right.
So, and at that moment, we were still operating on the fact that there had been an accident.
Right.
So we see another plane coming in towards them, and my first reaction is, maybe they're coming in to help. Is there any way they can drop water to douse the flames? I don't know. I'm not saying I was thinking rationally, but I certainly. And as it got closer, I'd say in that last 15 seconds, that sinking feeling, because I could see it was a commercial jetliner, and I knew it. And I'd never been in a war zone, so I can't compare it to that. I can only say that the explosion was enormous. The whole downtown rocked and vibrated. There was a huge fireball. And for me, it was obviously incredibly upsetting to the point where I'd still say I think I had sort of, I don't try to dramatize the whole thing, but the couple years after, I got very depressed on the day. Minor form of PTSD, I don't know, but it was really terrifying. And seeing things falling down from the Trade Center and finding out later that was people, and all that. And that, frankly, had the thing hit an hour later, I might not be here because I was on my way there.
Right.
You know what I mean? So for me, it's always been a little tougher. But the truth is, 14 years later, there's no doubt that as time goes on, that stuff it gets easier. You know what I mean? For me, the first couple of years after, I didn't even like thinking about it. Whereas now it's a little different. So yeah, I mean, it was a terrible day.
Yeah, I mean that is. I mean, I think that is my sense too. It's almost and I think I had seen it all in much in the way that you're talking about, but from like 28th Street on the east side on the roof of my building actually. After the first plane, and I think I had that same sort of like there was a sense of just you were scared. I mean, I just remember feeling sort of very uneasy for at least a year or two, and even well after that, there was always that when you started hearing planes, when they started letting planes fly back over Manhattan, which took a while, it was scary.
Yeah, I mean, did you ever have it like where you're in the street and, I lived in D.C. at the time, but obviously was back in New York a lot because that's where my family is and that's where some of my clients were, and you'd hear like a car backfire.
Yep.
And I swear to God, people would just sort of jump.
Yep.
Some of them would, I mean, I was remember in Farragut North area of D.C. having a couple people actually jump down to the pavement because there was like a bus backfired. I mean, that's how you were walking around. It's so hard to do it justice. I'm a writer, so I'm supposed to be able to do these things, but I don't know that I can do it justice, and how sort of scary it was for a lot of people, how, I mean, and then in New York, where I was right after it happened, and you probably remember too, Sam, when you're going the Armory on 26th Street.
Well, that's where I lived. I lived 2 blocks from that Armory, right on.
So you remember all the pictures of all
yes.
I mean, because, in the end, there really was nobody injured for the most part.
Right.
Was a terrible thing. I mean, you either
a lot of people. I remember like heading
yeah.
to give blood, and people were just like, they're not taking blood. Like, I mean, everybody assumed like the first thing you should do is go and give blood, and then like within a couple hours, they're like, there's no, you either made it or you didn't.
That's right.
And there was very.
I mean, those pictures were just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
All of them up there, and. So because that was near where I was staying at my mom's place while I was back in New York on that campaign for about 6 weeks, I was walking by there pretty much every day, as I guess you were. You were living there. And, I mean, it just was, oh, my God, that made it so that it couldn't end. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It couldn't be finite. It just kept going.
Oh, and
and that made it even tougher.
For months, I can't remember how long, there would be, it seemingly every day, and sometimes more than once, there would be a police-led procession of cars that would go, if I remember correctly, they shifted at different times, but when they found remains, they would go in a trail of multiple vehicles and bring those remains, I believe, to I think it was Bellevue. Or it was somewhere right over there, maybe that NYU Center, right on like 29th or 30th, away on the east side. So it was the city was still, I mean, was that it took a long time before any type of like normalcy returned to the city. I mean months, if not over a year.
And D.C. wasn't hit as badly, obviously, because it was outside of D.C. in the Pentagon, but still that sense of paranoia, right? Like, just, I can't even explain it. Different than anything that I've ever felt before. You just felt like people were watching you. You felt like, and that's because, remember, people forget, right afterwards, there was the anthrax thing.
Right.
And that just compounding it, you started feeling like, oh my God, the world's just falling apart. Right. I mean, when you put that on top of it, it was like, this is a multi-pronged attack that we're perhaps living through. And everything I thought about being safe here in the United States and all the other stuff is just not true. And I go back and forth between the two cities that are the 2 biggest targets in this country. So.
And to a large extent, I think a lot of that there was a lot of advantage taken of that. I mean, obviously, it was much easier, I think, to lead this country into war because of it.
Yes, absolutely.
And, in some respects, I mean, just to bring it back to what took place this week, and there was an attempt at one point, or at least there was talk that the Republicans in the House were going to have the vote on the Iran deal. They were going to hold it on 9/11, which would have sort of been a certain amount of poetry insofar as it shows that the Republican Party was willing to sort of conflate whatever it wanted, as long as it had to do with sort of foreign policy, that they would tie
even
it
domestically, like when it came to the spying and certain things. I mean, I guess you could call that foreign policy of a sort, but how
national security.
How they treat, national, anything national security, and that touches us domestically too. They got away with all sorts of things. I mean, remember the Patriot Act, obviously, and things right afterwards, where I think if we'd been thinking more clearly. But, that was a huge, it wasn't just the attack, it's that it was on TV. I mean, the evil marketing bastards at Al-Qaeda got it right, because it caused a lot more damage, far beyond the actual damage it caused. And there's no doubt we were manipulated for that. And the thing is, Sam, I don't know if you had this sort of response, but because that was such a real day to me on a number of levels, and because I felt so strongly after that wanting, to say, let's do what's best for this country, we're under attack and that kind of thing, that made me hate the Bush administration that much more, like loathe them. That he took this moment where we could have, tried to, I'm not saying we'd be best buddies forever, but could have, for the sake of the country, tried to come together for a period of time and work together and move forward, and he used it for exactly the opposite purpose. And that always just made me detest them that much more.
Yeah, I mean, I it's hard for me to sort of parse that stuff out because I was really obsessed with the election. I still contend in many respects that election, or the way that was resolved, that selection, if you will, really ultimately was the begin. I mean, it's interesting when you put it in that threes, in terms of Iraq, the 9/11 and the election, because I really think that election was that was the moment where if we did not sort of address that, which we never did as a country ever address that. That really I found to be problematic, and I still contend, like in many years, I think when historians look back on this with sort of clearer eyes, I think there'll be an understanding that that was the turning point. That things like Iraq were sort of not necessarily inevitable, but certainly. Well,
it wasn't. It was the result of that.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, I agree with you. I mean, I have those three things. And again, I will never sit here and say President Al Gore would have been Superman and prevented everything. What I will say is President Al Gore, unlike President George W. Bush, cared deeply about policy, was interested in foreign policy, was somebody who studied these things and would have been a continuation of the Bush administration, which had been prioritizing
the Clinton
Al-Qaeda
administration, right.
And bin Laden, unlike Bush, who came in and said, and Condi Rice was like, oh, Russia's the real threat, and wouldn't hold meetings with Richard Clark. And we now know from Kurt, what's-his-name's book, that there were over 60 different warnings, not just the 3 or 4 we heard about that said bin Laden determined to attack the United States,
right.
but 60 plus of these types of warnings, evidence everywhere if you cared to look and were doing your job. And I don't care. People they can say what they want. I will contend that if it had happened, it would not have been as bad. That some of it would have been prevented if Al Gore had been president, because he would have been paying attention. And that's, and I think that when I think about that, I think about the response in Iraq, which we know Gore wouldn't have gone into Iraq. He came out against it. I mean, granted, he was a different person after not being in government, but I don't think that would have happened. I just think it changes the entire history, and it's all from that one moment.
I agree.
The Supreme Court we got, by the way, was from Bush and not Gore, and they gave us Citizens United. I mean, it's like the poison, the fruit from the poison tree.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there was if I remember this correctly, there was a speech or an event, and in January of 2001, Sandy Berger, I think, was the national security advisor. And it was literally, I think, called like the pass the baton or passing the baton, where Sandy Berger got up and reiterated what the Clinton administration thought was the primary national security threat to the U.S., which was non-state actors, specifically Al-Qaeda, but non-state actors. And, this is after they had stopped the millennial bombing. Condi Rice got up there and said the absolute opposite. We believe it's state actors. And
look, Richard Clarke laid this all out.
Right.
I mean, if you read his book, the Clinton people were meeting with him. They were doing things. He didn't just purposely say, oh, Clinton was awesome. He said there was more they could have done. They weren't perfect. But he said they were meeting with him. They were taking it seriously. They were prioritizing it. And then the Bush people came in and basically shut the whole thing down. And would Gore have been on the ranch with his cowboy hat on, clearing brush in August and getting ready to give an important big speech about stem cells, and the morality of it, if he had just gotten that August 6th warning that we know Bush got? No, I really don't believe it, and I don't think that that's just me talking about somebody who I favored, because there's plenty of Democrats I could have not so nice things to say about their intellects, but Gore's not one of them. I think he would have taken that very seriously, and who knows?
And there's 20 some odd pages. There's 20 some odd pages of that 9/11 report that remain redacted. And by all accounts, from what we've sort of gleaned from what former Senator Bob Graham has said, and by all accounts, the Saudis or parts of the Saudi royal family are implicated in this, or in some fashion.
Yep.
And certainly
never got to the bottom of that.
Certainly, the Bush administration had a relationship with the Saudis that they certainly wanted to maintain. Now, the only upside, I guess, and it's small consolation, but Joe Lieberman was not vice president, and 2008, the idea of Joe Lieberman as the president of the United States.
Al Gore would have treated him the way he's treated him ever since.
I
could be wrong. What was the vice president's name on in the West Wing? Like that dude. Like, that's great. You kept the moderates in line. Now go off to your own
but what
thing.
happens in 2008, right? I mean, are we now getting ending the 8 years of President Joe Lieberman and Social Security's? I mean, who knows with that guy? I mean,
that's true. I mean, and I'm glad you're putting that out there, because it's best to not pretend life is perfect and everything's great. If the 90s continue and Gore takes over, we also know on the economic front, things were going great for a while in the 90s, but inevitably somebody was going to have to pay the bill eventually of deregulating Wall Street. And had Lieberman gotten in, he would have continued that process.